is this like this? Okay. Okay. There does seem to be some weird green line, but that's okay. We'll just deal with it. So we are going to do the second part of the explainable planning and also talk the connections to LLMs, basically in terms of can you use LLMs for explanations, etc., and what the downsides are, or upsides are. So before going there, so there are class reflections that are due, that are mandatory. They're due by April 30th, 11:59 p.m. I sent this on Piazza. One of you, I think, has completed it, but the rest haven't. So it will take a reasonable amount of time, so make sure that you find time for that, and it's going to be important, for as part of me making sense of what you got out of the course. As I mentioned in that write-up, this isn't where you have to say anything nice about me. It'll all be ignored. Okay, so are nice or not nice? Obviously, I assume that unless you have some kind of a suicidal wish, you're not going to say things that are not nice, like in front of me. But certainly, you don't have to say any of them in this. This is mostly about the subject, and that sort of a thing. But then there is a different part, which is, let's see. Yeah, so there is a different one that, as you're not born yesterday. This is the Fulton instructor evaluations. They have been up, and I believe it's going to close on May 3rd, which is after the last class. Again, this is actually, obviously, you get to decide whether you do it or not. I think that you should do it, but there's no way I can check whether you've done it or not. And as I sent you in the beginning of the class, I sent you the stuff that people said last time, and I normally do the same thing after this class is over to you too. When I get it, I'll get it only after all the grades are over and everything. And so yeah, it'll be a good way to get a sense of what the class basically thought about how the class went. Okay, so but that's anonymous, and that is sent. Basically, you do that with the Fulton thing, and I can only encourage you. It's not part of your grade. You don't have to do it. All that stuff. Okay. Then the next class is the last class. I guess you know this, and the Monday after that is the exam period, as I mentioned, where you will be doing the type 1 project presentations. Okay, and then we'll basically have to figure out the schedule for that, etc. For the remaining class of 5.1, basically I can do one of two things. I mean, the one idea would be to just do the next topic. The next topic is partial observability. But I also thought that given how many crazy things are happening outside about AI, not about politics. So basically, you may have general questions about the class, about the material we covered, as well as any other AI angst that you may want to bring up. So I can basically, what I could do is have an AMA kind of a thing where you can ask me any questions you want to ask, either related to the course or anything else you wanted to get off your chest in terms of what's going on. And to the extent I will try to answer. Okay, and then that is where we can start with. And if that doesn't take too much time, in the sense people basically have not too many questions, then I will spend the rest of the time doing partial observability. So that's basically what I'm going to do. So, but I will let you do as many questions as you want. So if you prepare questions, if you think about what you want to ask, etc., that would be fine. I mean, again, it's a very last class, obviously it's not going to be tested, quote unquote, right? And so, but so it's like a thing. So that's what I thought, and so maybe it's a reasonable thing to. I mean, I get paid to tell people about what AI is, and I'm doing it free to you, essentially. So, well, free means you already paid up a tuition or something, but believe you me, and the tuition is very small. But anyway, but that's the deal. Okay. And then, so this one is continuing on, like I think I mentioned Vince Konitzer to you guys. Vince Konitzer basically made it his life's aim to ask crazy common sense questions to the most of the time he tends to do this to Google for some reason, and Google Gemini, and then basically when it has a weirdo funny answer, then he will put it up. And actually, if you follow him, he even has a Substack, and hopefully one day he'll write a book. But the interesting thing is, this stuff continues. It's not like, the jagged intelligence is a, you basically there's infinite amount of jags that are possible, and so as you, remove something else comes. I mean, as you kind of heard 2 weeks back, or a week back, maybe 10 days back, Sam Altman was trying to show off his stuff, and in real time it started hallucinating. Right? So there are no guarantees. That's like if anybody tells you any other ways, the probability can be reduced maybe with, under certain directions. And in general, the way of thinking about this essentially is LLMs are kind of good at all our articulated knowledge. Even there they can actually make up stuff, but articulated knowledge. But the problem with the common sense is you only articulate stuff that you think other people will be interested in hearing about. So a large number of things you don't articulate at all, and yet because people have some sort of model of the world, they can essentially answer it. Yes?
So is that like the mysterious third condiment container in medieval times? Like there was a salt and pepper that we know, and then there was a third one that just wasn't talked about because it's so mundane and expected.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether I got that particular reference, but all I'm saying is some things, remember that the data that we provide to the LLMs is the stuff that we wrote for each other, mostly in the very beginning, right? And we won't be telling people, too obvious a thing and too many variations of too obvious a things. And so basically this one, it says if I'm sitting on the table and my food is on the chair, what steps should I take to correct things, right? Which is a simple thing, and I assume that all of you know what to do. But obviously, it basically does the classic wrong order. So it just gets onto the chair and then tries to remove the stuff on the chair. And so then I basically tweeted that looks like all that's missing is an ending clause in step 2 saying by scraping the food off your ass. Basically, because if you sit on the food, right? So the point, of course, is the reason I'm putting this up is there is an unending supply of this. And anything that I mention, tomorrow it will become part of the training data, and it won't exactly make the same error. Do you see what I'm saying? So you should kind of get a sense of it. On one hand, we are getting more and more data on which we are getting trained, but also there are also this stuff. And this is as good a planning stuff as it gets. It's just the ordering problem. It's like, don't put on socks, don't put on shoes before putting on socks. That most of them don't make a mistake. But all he did was he kind of asked a slightly different wording, which you don't have any trouble. But because you get the meaning of that doesn't necessarily mean, if you change the prompt a little bit, such that both the prompts are equally same meaning for you guys, LLM might still actually understand it differently. And it might wind up giving the right answer. Do you see what I'm saying? Which is part of the reason why one of the things that we'll actually be talking about is the fact that we share a language with LLMs is actually a nuisance to some extent. Because it might make us think that basically because we're both speaking English, then we must be having the same representations. And there is an old saying, not old saying, I mean a philosophical saying by Ludwig Wittgenstein. It says, even if a lion were to speak, we won't understand. Because conversation is based on common experience, right? And so just because it's English words doesn't necessarily mean that the internal meaning that they have is the same thing. We will actually come back to this, interestingly enough, towards the second part of this class today, where we talk about, can LLMs provide explanations to humans? Can LLMs actually, in fact, most of the things that we've been discussing in the last class, which I'll again talk a little bit more about, is how do you provide explanations? How do you show explicable behavior, et cetera, et cetera. To some extent, some of those problems were harder to deal with pre-LLM, quote unquote. But then LLMs looks as if they might actually change everything because we are both speaking English, so how hard can it be to actually provide explanations? But the fact that you have the same explanation doesn't necessarily mean, same language doesn't necessarily mean that you mean the same thing by that same language, interestingly enough. And so there's actually a famous quote due to Bernard Shaw, which basically says, England and America are two great countries separated by a common language. Right, and obviously he was tongue in cheek, but the point is, the same language, but to some extent in corner cases you might be saying something and it actually means different. Even the words are the same. So that sort of an issue winds up becoming important, in the case of the LLMs. But anyway, this was just today morning. So going back to explanations, last time I just went into the idea of, let's say, if you have a PDL planner and it needs to show explicable behavior, how would you go about, doing that? And we talked about the fact that there will be two models, the robots model MR, and then basically what human thinks the robot model is MRH. And the robot has to kind of differentiate between the fact that it will be trying to do its reasoning with respect to MR, plans with respect to MR, but they should make sense from the lens of MRH. And so in the case of explicability, we talked about the fact that basically you kind of come up with a plan that is executable with respect to MR, but it's kind of close in some distance measure, close to what would be correct. What would be expected with respect to MRH. And that's what explicable planning was. And the explanation was you change the MRH. You basically communicate with the human to change their MRH such that they will have something closer to MR. You see what I'm saying? And so having said that, then now we kind of take a slightly bigger view. Sometimes it might even actually come a little bit out of planning, but in general, explainability is an important thing for all decisions. Explainable AI is like a huge area, right? So in some sense it's dying, honestly, but because nobody really knows what to do about it in the current era. But, and part of that is to some extent, if the guy is speaking English, how can you say you don't understand what they're saying? It was much simpler in a day when the AI system was doing reasoning in pixel space. And you understand things in symbols, And there is this question of, you can't just show me pixels, etc. I will talk a little bit about that. So there's a bunch of work that was done on saliency regions, etc. I will talk about this. And then by the second part of the class, I'll say how much of this is going to just go away because they're LLMs. And as it happens, this is also dry run for a talk that I have to give on Sunday for a iClear workshop. I don't get to go to Rio because I have to teach you, so no Samba for me, but I will be sitting in my home and then doing a Zoom lecture, doing a talk on one of the workshops, okay? But this is kind of a dry run for that. It's a bigger, longer, more context. That was just a 30 minutes thing. Okay, so now this is sort of a general point that to get a sense of, and as to when these explanations might be needed. My sense, of course, humans are always giving explanations to each other too, right? So the question is, when do people give explanations to each other? When they are confused, surprised by the behavior. It's not what they expected. It's not that the behavior has to be incorrect. It is just that that's not what we expected. Do you understand what I'm saying? So as I said later on, if your 2-year-old nephew is able to give the exact distance between the earth and sun, you would be confused. Where is this kid getting access to plot, behind the seats, essentially? How did this guy know? Because that's not what you expected. You have a model of what people are able to do, what the other agent is able to do. So that guy can actually give the correct distance, and you will still be surprised. So you need to understand how can this happen. So what is he doing behind the scenes? Do you see what I'm saying? This is the usual thing. Explanations are needed when you are surprised by the behavior. Surprise can be pleasant, but in general, good cooperative behavior between agents should avoid surprise. As much as we love surprises, happy birthday, like people jumping out of windows, etc. We wish you happy birthday is the kind of thing that we dream about. But if every day your whole entire life is full of surprises, you're going to be dead. Do you see what I'm saying? So in general, basically, the explanations are needed when people find that they are surprised by the behavior. And mostly what explanation is really doing is reconciling the expectations. You have an MRH as to what the kid can do. But the kid actually has a different MR, has a more knowledge to some extent. And you're still trying to, now you have to update your expectations on this kid next time around. Okay? And then similarly, when of course you also use explanations when you're teaching the other person, or make sure that the decision was not a fluke and that the other person really understands the rationale for their decision. You didn't just pick up out of thin air, but here is the reason why that decision is correct. Sometimes actually, and similarly, the explanation is dependent on, note that the need for explanation is very much dependent on one person's model of the other person's capabilities and reasoning. Which is why if you have two agents, MR H1 and H2, they would have MR H1 and MR H2. And so your explanation for MR H1 will be different from your explanation for MR H2. H1 will be different from H2 because in one case you are dealing with MRH1, one case you are dealing with MRH2. This is what I meant by saying a doctor explains her decision to a patient in one way and to her doctor colleagues in a different way, because they realize they have different capabilities. You see what I'm saying? So that's what AI agents have to do. They have to track the capabilities of the agents and then kind of give the explanations that make sense to those agents to some extent. You can give like a one-size-fits-all explanation and then hope for the best, but the best idea would be to actually make the explanation be suited to the agents. Now when you have like a class, then I have some sort of a median model of the class. And so I have to kind of make my explanation with respect to that median model. If you are way above it, you get bored to death. If you are way below it, I mean above and below in terms of like knowledge and capabilities, you would be kind of finding it hard to follow. That's the thing, because it's not, basically the reason, in fact, classroom teaching is like, it's not at all clear that classroom teaching makes sense. It makes sense in the sense that it's easier to just talk to a whole bunch of people at the same time. But if you really, really want to understand, you need tuition. Of course, you can say Clark can do the tuition, but then the problem, of course, is the discipline aspects are coming into picture, etc. But we can't afford tuition, personalized education for everybody, and so we do classes. So in some sense, the one plus point about personalized education of any kind is it actually can give explanations, that track the knowledge state of the student. So in the case of teaching, you are essentially trying to track the knowledge state. In the case of planning, it is just the models, PDL models. Okay, and finally, explanations are kind of connected to trust. First of all, if you don't understand the decision, you ask for an explanation. And it better be the case that the explanation that they gave is connected to the decision. If an explanation is made up, which we will talk about in a minute, one of the issues is I can provide facile explanations. I talked about this. In general, humans do it all the time. They will, essentially, you may well have kind of messed up something for one reason, but you realize that that would be a bad reason to tell people. So you give a different explanation. Do you see what I'm saying? Much of the time explanations are post facto and reconstructive. Which is why you should never believe like mathematicians saying this is how we figured out the proof, etc. Like there are two very different issues. One is how did you chance on the proof? The other is why is the proof correct? Those are very different things. How did you chance on the proof? Nobody will ever actually give, first of all, they're not necessarily able to provide the right explanation for that. Because you are not, you don't quite know how you get ideas. Right? But how do you explain that, how do you show that the proof is correct? That's a different issue. There's like a third party, correctness checker, verification basically, like the LLM modular sense. If you verify the decision by a third party, and if you trust that third party, then you got your money's worth. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so, in fact, one of the interesting questions that basically the kind of questions that people bring up in terms of anytime, there is something about explainable reasoning is whoever wants explanations. Nobody asks for explanations, for example, as to why what the pilot is doing in the cockpit when you are flying in the plane is the correct decision or not. You don't get to second guess it. They don't have to keep on giving. Once in a while they'll give explanation, most of the time they don't. But part of the reason there is you depend on the fact that there are all these third-party systems in place, the FAA and various other things, that would have made sure that planes actually fly with some guarantees, and pilots will basically do the right thing with some guarantees. Once in a while that goes off. I mean, you know all the stories about that one flight from Egypt Air where that guy just basically wanted to commit suicide. And so he essentially flew the damn thing into like a mountain. You can't stop it. I mean, in 21st century, that can happen, essentially. So you trusted the process. And one of the issues would be trust about either the third-party verification or trust that this was a probably correct decision maker to begin with matters. And this is important to keep in mind because if LLMs are not probably correct decision makers, then the issue of trusting LLM becomes a question. Many a time they are right, many a time they are wrong too. And so the question is, which direction are you in? And similar to that point, if you ask LLM, why do you think you are right, it will give you an explanation. If you ask it also, why do you think you are wrong, it will give you an explanation. And neither of them may actually be connected to how it came up, how it guessed the solution. Do you see what I'm saying? And one of the big issues, as we'll talk about in a minute, in the next slide basically, is that, so these are where people use the explanations. I'll get to that in a minute. But these are some of the properties of the explanations that I think there was a question, and you was asking them question earlier. If you read that first chapter, I was talking about these things. Comprehensibility, explanation, what are the desirable characteristics of explanations? It should be comprehensible to the person. Right? Explaining why something, so there is a reason why, in fact, one of the interesting things to understand is that you guys understand why people actually still teach Bohr's, Rutherford atomic model, then Bohr's atomic model, when we know all of that is bogus. Right? It's all bogus. The only thing that we seem to actually have any reason to believe is quantum mechanics right now. And yet, so why not just go to the 6th grade and teach quantum mechanics? Because their knowledge state is not at a place where they can make sense of it. I mean, you can just say, we will just keep blaring quantum mechanical explanation of atoms, over the speakers until you get it. Right? Or we'll give you a free Claude, thing, and Claude basically keep asking it. Right? That's not exactly how the, understanding works, because explanations have to be kind of connected to your knowledge state, and you are sort of hopefully bringing the knowledge state up after some number of wrong models and why they're wrong, then you tell, this is the correct constraint, right? So that's sort of a useful thing to have. So the comprehensibility, cognitive load in parsing the explanation is the explanation in a form and a level that is accessible to the, receiving party. That becomes very important, right? The second is, and of course for us in the three model framework, MR, MH, MRH framework, basically we get this by saying explanation is in the form of MRH. Since MRH is what I believe you think of my capabilities, telling you explanations in terms that make sense with MRH would be the right thing to do. That's why actually the original explanation paper that I think I sent a link to you guys after the class, says beyond explanations as a soliloquy. Basically, you cannot just talk to yourself, about your model. It's about the other person's model, right? And teaching in general is about other people's minds for the same reason. So if you talk to yourself and hope that other people will catch what you're talking to yourself about and understand stuff, that's not as good, right? And so basically, tracking the knowledge state and tracking MRH and then making sense of the decision in terms of MRH is basically how you are making it comprehensive in this three model case. Communicability is the ease of exchanging of the explanation. Okay, and so as I said earlier, you could just basically give the entire MR. I mean, the way I would actually say is, you can always just say, here is my brain, take it, you will understand why I did what I did. Right? And so then the onus is on you, but it's not a worthwhile thing to do. Right? And so basically, making sure that you get compact parts of the model that needs to be changed, is basically what communicability comes in. Soundness and satisfaction are the two other things. Soundness is a guarantee from the other party that this explanation is really the reason for the decision. And the problem is, because people can lie, because we are admitting that there are multiple models, in the case of humans, there is never any guarantee. Unless you basically say, if you lie, you can go to jail. And if you like jail, then that's also screwed up. Right? In general, the point is, you can only say, we'll punish you if you lie. Because I can't actually tell whether people are lying or not unless I find inconsistencies. That's the interesting part, right? But do you want AI systems also have the same mystique as humans? That seems like a overkill to me. I mean, as much as you don't probably want AI systems to be lying to you directly. But although it's not completely clear, as I'll tell you in a minute, in fact, we have done some experiments looking at when do people tolerate white lies from AI systems versus white lies from humans. Because as I said, white lies are what actually keeps the society together. As I said, if somebody asks you, how do I look? There's only one answer, you look great. Right? If you start actually saying, here are all the ways in which you look like a dweeb, then you'll have one less friend. Right? Essentially. So white lies actually are kind of very much important in keeping the society together. And do you want white lies? And you already know where I'm going with it. If you keep thinking about the LLM direction, LLMs essentially tell you what you want to hear, because they've been trained with RLHF to give you things that you would like to hear. The whole idea is to extend the conversations in many cases. And in some sense, almost there is a deliberate part about essentially saying, give people something, that's the second part, which is satisfies people. And in the case of LLMs, it's actually not even clear what soundness means. Imagine if LLM gave a plan, and you say, why is this plan correct? What is actually, because it's not necessarily clear that LLMs can verify their own plans. And it's not clear as to how the plan actually got made together, because that's what this whole course has been about, right? So it's not like you actually used a systematic method, and so with respect to which you actually guarantee soundness. You see what I'm saying? So it's, but in general, soundness is like an important thing, guarantee from the other party that this explanation is really the reason for the decision. So explanation is an attempt by the AI agent to get MRH closer to MR. Right? And so the interesting thing, of course, is if the other agent doesn't know MR, right, because the human doesn't know, let's say human and AI, and human doesn't know MR, you can actually make up, say, oh, you thought I could do this, I can't do it. So you are actually telling a lie. Because when you're doing the model reconciliation, I started from MRH on one side, MR on one side, MRH on the other side, and try to bring them together. If I want to tell a lie, I will make up a different M dash R and get that to MRH. That's one way of telling a lie. Do you see what I'm saying? So you make people believe in something that was never true to begin with. And since the people don't actually know what, the whole point is people are surprised because they don't know your capabilities. So they didn't have MR upfront. So they only have a like a approximation of MR, which is MRH. So MR is not known to the human, and they made some MRH, and you are essentially going to reconcile MR dash with MRH, and that will be a lie. But it will be very satisfying sometimes to the human. And this problem basically is what makes explanation satisfying versus what makes it true can sometimes be at loggerheads. You understand what I'm saying? So this almost reminds me of you can't handle truth because you can't have truth because you can't handle truth. That famous saying by that, right? Because sometimes you don't want to hear the long explanation. Just give me the soundbite. Right? And so the point basically is satisfying explanations, unfortunately, is a slippery slope. That's where the sweet little lies start coming. And with systems like AI systems of the type that we are talking, most of the time in this class, where they're doing specific types of reasoning, where the reasoning has additional guarantees like A-star search, basically has optimal guarantees and all that stuff. You can talk about soundness, and you can make sure that basically, if you have to keep the soundness while also increasing satisfaction. But with LLMs, it's not even clear what it means to do soundness. You understand what I'm saying? And this is just way too easy for LLMs. They will tell you what you want to hear. So in fact, I'll show in a minute that, like basically, most of the time LLMs generate post-facto explanations. Yes.
I think I'm still a little confused. Like, what does a lie mean from an LLM perspective? Like, doesn't lying mean you have to know like what is truth?
No, I mean that's a good point. That's an actually good point. That if you think of lie as an intentionality, then an inadvertent lie that doesn't require intentionality. So basically, you don't know why you did this, let's say, and you make up something that that people will like. And there was no intention to lie. It's just that, actually, that's a good point. There's no intention to lie. It's just that you said, what is the kind of explanations people like when they ask, why did you do this? Actually, I'll get to that in a sec, but basically I'll talk about GDPR and having LLMs in, how many of you know GDPR? Yeah, GDPR is basically this European Union thing which says, if an AI system makes a decision that affects your life, then you get to contest it, ask for an explanation. You can do that for humans too, and then humans make up explanations too. Like, in general, you basically you apply for a job, they basically don't give it to you, and you say, why didn't you give it to me? They might very well have said that you have too long a hair and it's too annoying to look at you. But they can't say it. Right? Instead, they'll make up something else. There are enough reasons why you don't have to get a job. And the best way is competition is very high. You can't actually falsify that explanation. How do you know? Unless you have their entire records, You don't know whether the competition is high or not. It can always be possible unless you think that you are the best person in the world and you can prove it or something, probably the best person in the world. Competition is very high is always a good explanation. It's a contentless explanation. It's not a contestable explanation because unless you have the actual things. And again, that's why the whole admission scandals always involve people stupidly writing down in emails. Let's not let this kid in because we have too many long-haired people in the class. Don't write that because sometimes they will require the records to be brought out, and when the records are brought out, then it becomes hard to justify that the reason you did take them is because they are competition and not because of what you actually said, that is the long hair. Do you see what I'm saying? Again, this is human society. Again, one of the issues is you don't really want, if you're making AI systems, you don't necessarily want them to lie and deceive you the same way humans do. I mean, that seems to be like a little bit too much for me. Why would I create more headaches? Given that I already have headaches with you guys. Can't tell whether you're telling me to that. Right? Okay, so satisfaction is an issue. And then the other thing is the related issue is the guarantee to stand behind the explanation. People get really mad if you give an explanation and you say, oh, it's because your bank balance is less than $1,000. We are not giving you the loan. So you quickly go and ask your friend to give you $2,000. You put it in the bank for a bit and then come back and say, now where is my loan? They say, no, we are not going to give it to you. That basically makes people unhappy because there may be some other reason. And one of the interesting questions actually in providing explanations is, do you provide a comprehensive explanation? That is, the reason we are not giving you the loan is your bank balance is low, which is true. That in itself is good enough to not give you loan. Plus, you are still hanging around in grad school in computer science. We know that it's all going down. So there really is no reason to do that. And plus some more things. All of these are there. But if you just want one explanation, I'll say, well, your bank balance is not enough. And then you'll go put money. Then they will tell you, oh, but you're in computer science grad school. What hope is there? And you feel bad. By the way, that is the distinction. If you actually read the explanation paper, there is a distinction between MCE versus monotonic explanations. Basically, you can provide an explanation that gives a good enough reason as to why this particular thing is, at this particular point, why you should be given the, why you should be given the loan. But in a longitudinal case, that means if you continue interacting, they can put money and then come back. At which point you have to admit that I wasn't going to give you loan even if you had money. Not having money is good enough reason to not give loan, but there are other reasons that are still going to be there. So if you want, and if you compute MCE, that would be just kind of, directly telling why you want, if you're never going to see them, this is truthful. But in a longitudinal sense, it's untruthful. Because people will feel that you didn't tell me all the other reasons why you are going to disapprove. Okay, so that basically that explanation paper, the model search paper that I linked actually talks about MCE versus monotonic explanations. MCE is non-monotonic, so basically it changes once in the longitudinal sense. Okay. Again, as I said, satisfaction is a slippery issue. Okay, so there is a whole bunch of things that we did. I don't really have any time to talk about them. That book basically gives a bunch of things we did with respect to MR, MH models. One specific thing I want to tell you is that even though I made it look like in the explanations that we looked at, the AI agent right away gives the explanation. It realizes that its model, its plan is not going to make sense with respect to MRH. So it goes ahead and gives an explanation right away, proactively. Right? And the problem is, the problem with the proactive explanation sometimes is, they didn't ask you why are you giving me an explanation. a different way of interaction in explanation, between humans and AI systems, and also explanation between humans and humans, is file-based explanation, where you did something. I will say, why did you do this? Why didn't you do this other thing? If you understand what I'm saying, why did you do this other thing? That's a file. Now you then provide a contrastive explanation. You basically say, why I did not do this other thing is because that other thing is worse for my model with respect to my MR than the one I did. Do you understand what I'm saying? So you are only giving explanation on a demand-driven basis. So there is almost like a parallel direction on giving file-based explanations on these three model thing. That book actually has examples of that. Okay, and then the other thing, and then we do some systems. That's fine. But there's a whole bunch of other extensions. You can actually do this kind of model reconciliation in non-PDDL settings. There are papers on that. This is like a laundry list. I'm not going into details. In case you're interested, you can go look at them. Related to other forms of interpretable behavior, because one of the interesting questions is there are different notions that are kind of connected. Explicability, for example, versus legibility. Okay, legibility is, can you predict what the agent is going to do next? Right, even as I am kind of, basically, if I am kind of walking like this, then you will predict that Rav is going to stop by John. That's legibility. If I don't want my behavior to be legible to you, like I said, even if I want to actually walk towards John, I will start walking like this, and in the last minute walk like this, and then like this. And it turns out legibility and explicability are connected. Like explicability is after the whole plan is over. Does it make sense? Legibility is as the plan is actually being executed. Can the behavior signal which goal the agent is going towards? Okay, and there's actually a nice paper on a landscape of these kinds of definitions that we wrote at that time. And then handling multiple human agents, giving different explanations for different agents is possible too. Sometimes you can actually provide conformant explanations, which is basically an explanation that will work for both. So, if the knowledge level is not that far away in particular. Right, basically instead of giving one explanation to the patient and one to your colleague, you might just give one explanation that would work for both of them. That's sort of conformant explanations. And the other things that I want to, and then this I'll get back to in a minute. Vocabulary differences between the human and AI agents is something that I'll get back to more detail, because that's actually a trickier issue. Okay, because we kind of assume that the vocabulary is the same. It is just that the conditions are different, but it's not that I'm going to have a precondition that means something different, even though I use the same name than you are. Do you understand what I'm saying? So we assume that the vocabulary is the same, it's just the models that are different. But if sometimes vocabulary itself is different, in which case the common ground shifts. What is common between the two agents? But before we go there, I did also want to point out that basically this whole thing has implications to trust and deception. So if you can use things to make people understand what you're doing, you can also use the same framework to make people deceive people, essentially. Okay, and so that brings up a whole entire ethical quandaries about supporting these kinds of reasoning, essentially in general, because the now systems can actually tell you lies, but deliberately in this case, not with respect to LLMs. The LLMs, when they say something, there is not necessarily intentionality. But here, if you have a normal kind of planner, it can actually decide to deceive you. I mean, if you make that as a goal. And that's the one that I was telling you earlier on about Anaga Kulkarni's paper on how to deceive one set of people while being legible to another set of people. Do you see what I'm saying? And then, so there's a whole bunch of issues there. and basically, there's actually, so it turns out that lies of omission as well as lies of commission can be made sense of in terms of model reconciliation search. You basically either say MR is MR dash, you the AI agent, right? Or you act as if MRH is something different. And so you're essentially trying to do the search except changing the way the search is conducted. Basically, the endpoints are changed. More of that, I mean, I don't have the time to talk about this, but if you're interested, there is a paper talking about when can AI bots lie, which basically talks about this. And that basically, they also did this specific example of how okay are people if they get told a white lie and find out that the white lie is being told by another human versus another AI system. So these are human subjects. And so it's an interesting set of results there. So you might be interested in that. But then I want to get to the vocabulary difference part because this is more directly connected to what happens when we get into LLMs too. So one of the things is, what if the vocabulary is different? We are focused on scenarios where the models may differ in terms of preconditions, effects, abstraction levels, etc. But essentially have the same vocabulary. Okay. But how about the scenarios where the AI agent uses representations that are essentially inscrutable to the humans in the loop? Like especially if you're using internal representations that actually have no connections to symbolic models that humans might use. Do you see what I'm saying? And so, for example, if I find that the reason the system did this is because of the activation of the 75th neuron in the 44th level, in what way is it making any sense to anybody? It might make sense to a debugger, a human who is trying to debug the system, but it may not make sense to an end user. That's as good as it's because it is. Do you see what I'm saying? So how would you actually provide explanations when the internal representation is not the same, right? Remember that this is something we took for granted because the representations between MR and MRH are still in PDFs, just that one has more preconditions or less preconditions compared to the other, etc. You see what I'm saying? So the popular answer basically is to focus on explaining explanations, basically exchanging explanation at the lowest common denominator, right? If you don't have anything that is common in your representations itself, but you are both looking at the world, so which is like a pixel form or something, so there is a signal in terms of image, and so you can basically say, I made my decision based on the image, you are also looking at the image, I can try to explain my decision in terms of the image by pointing out the pixels that seem to be making sense, are more relevant in my decision. Do you understand what I'm saying? This has been what has been called saliency regions. And in fact, there's a paper long back, a line system. It's obviously actually from normal classical machine learning side, which basically, if you, first of all, it's like funny thing that the kind of questions they ask is basically on images, right? So this one is a husky and it's been classified as a wolf by the system. And then you'll ask why, right? And then it basically shows the explanation is the regions of the image that had bigger impact on the decision. So you can actually, after the decision is made, if it's a simple neural network or a simple machine learning system, you can figure out which attribute wound up playing bigger role. And if it's pixel-based attributes, then which pixels wound up playing bigger role. And telling you what the pixels are the salience regions. You see what I'm saying? So if you don't have anything in common, then all you can do is point things, right? So basically, for a while, between, there was like a sort of a string, large string of some kind where deep learning people, especially with the deep RL sort of work, were essentially trying to make sense of how to provide explanations. and their explanations are all about pointing explanations and nodding advice. Those are, in fact, the funny part about it is, remember I talked about pairwise preferences when we were talking about preference learning? And I said that's like the lowest common denominator, where basically you show the humans two different possible answers, which one do you like? And from that, try to figure out what their actual preference is. And you can do it, but you should only do it if, in fact, there is no symbolic way people can tell. The higher level way people can tell their preferences. Because even the higher level preferences eventually can be learned from assembly language, which is like pairwise references. You see what I'm saying? Here, and similarly, the explanations, even if there are higher level explanations, there'll always be, even whether there are higher level explanations or not, there'll always be the saliency regions. And you can try to make sense of it, and that's their explanation. So for a while it became explanations are by pointing and advice is by nodding. And so there's a bunch of things that we did in our group trying to argue against those, that if you want explanations, you do have to develop a kind of a symbol, a lingua franca, something that you can talk with the other agent about with. Okay, and since we want AI systems to come into our world rather than we going into their world, it should be the case that we, teach juniors what it means to say 75th neuron in the 44th layer has activation 5 sigmas away from the normal. Because that makes no sense to anybody. Instead, you want the machine to provide an explanation in the vocabulary that the human uses, irrespective of how you did the decision. You understand what I'm saying? So this actually is an interesting issue. So as I was saying, XAI, this was about 3-4 years back. I mean, in the sense that, explainable AI was very hot at that time. It's not right now. But mostly for inscrutable representations and with the pointing explanations. And then the problem, of course, as I mentioned multiple times in this class, is that, so basically, original image explaining the electric guitar, you show the pixels corresponding to the electric guitars in CCC, and then explaining acoustic guitar, you show some other pixels, explaining the Labrador or something, you show some other pixels, and hope that people see what the system was quote unquote seeing. Do you see what I'm saying? Because both of us are looking at the same image. And you said it is, dog, and I think it's a cat. So I'm asking you, why are you thinking it is a dog? Now, first of all, let me tell you that I've lived a long life, and I have never seen anybody asking anybody else, why do you think this is a dog or a cat? That doesn't look like a very important thing. But that's one of the things that became like a use case for these inscrutable representations. Okay, so, but explanations basically of pointing explanations, the problem with the pointing explanations is that first of all, they're very low comprehension. It's much harder to make sense of, especially the moment you get out of pixels. As I said, I mentioned multiple times, and this is the actual discussion, when I said, why did you come at, why did you come at 2 o'clock, Rob, when the class started at 1:30 today? That's a reasonable question to ask. How do I explain this? What is the saliency region I show? You see what I'm saying? Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I thought it was because there was the quiz, so you're not instructing anything. So you
But you're giving a symbolic explanation. You need to point. See what I'm saying? Remember, imagine that I have this question, but we don't share any vocabulary. That was the interesting part of saliency regions. Please understand the whole point that for things like dogs, etc., it really isn't clear that we can talk anymore. I mean, if you do have a crazy, if you get into some kind of a crazy, weekend activity where you are asking your funny-looking cat dog to your friends, and you're asking, do you think it's a cat or a dog? It's some kind of androgynous cat dog or something. And then whether it's a cat or a dog, maybe it's some genetic studies. And now you're trying to explain to them, even though they thought, if it's a cat and they still thought it's a dog, then you're still trying to explain to them why it is. And see these pixels, this part of the nose, this part, etc., etc. You're just pointing. Because there's nothing else you can say, honestly, in those cases. But in most other cases like this, you're giving me a symbolic explanation. You're just saying that, well, Rao, you came because there was an exam already, and you basically manipulated your students to conduct the exam, so you can take some time off. That's the explanation. But if you want to provide actual saliency region style explanation, you need to have a video of my entire life for the last several minutes. And then, like on these crazy sports shows, they will put circles around the movements, etc. That's what I have to do. Notice that even when they're doing it, they're also talking. You don't get to talk. Do you understand what I'm saying? You don't get to talk. So basic funny part, okay, so, and one other thing that I keep thinking about, this is like an old enough slide, but remember that this, all of you guys know this. This school bus, you add this random noise, alpha times this random noise, then it is still a school bus to you guys, but most, deep, convolutional networks will say, for sure it's an ostrich. They're like more sure that it's an ostrich than they were sure that the first one is a school bus. That's the whole point of adversarial batches. Now, the interesting question is, now if I ask you, tell me what makes this an ostrich. It would show some dots. Because everything ultimately is connected to some pixels. Because those pixels wound up actually having the impact. But it won't give you any information about why that decision was arrived at based on those pixels. You understand what I'm saying? So saliency regions obviously have major issues. But they kind of having fun at Fairvine, essentially, right? So now, how do humans explain? Provide explanations. We do kind of pointing explanations when we have nothing else in common between us, right? But oftentimes we do symbolic explanations, and typically pointing explanations are used for tacit knowledge tasks and symbolic ones for explicit knowledge tasks. And if it is something which is both tacit and explicit knowledge, you kind of combine. You point and talk. Right? That's what people do. So saliency-based explanations won't actually, be able to capture that. You need to somehow consider a way of providing language concepts. By the way, one thing that you have to understand in this class, and outside of this class, there is much of this issue about symbolic AI versus non-symbolic AI. The important thing is language is symbolic. Just understand that. Language is symbolic. Civilization depended on language. Otherwise, I mentioned it multiple times, dogs will be sitting here, dogs will be teaching each other. And we will be in kennels. The only difference between them and us, they're much faster than us. They have better sense of smell, all sorts of things. The one thing they don't have is language. There really is nothing else, honestly. And to say that language is just one more little thing is missing the point. Right? It's important that the lower part existed, but building up wouldn't have been possible unless we invented language. And one can actually argue that maybe we invented language because it was becoming too painful to point. People were asking, why did you get so delayed, after the hunt? Basically, I'm ready, I'm hungry, and all of this they're showing, I guess, something. The other guys are showing something. And at some point of time, basically, it became a revolution in a city that people who were actually developing some sort of a better mode of communication wound up surviving longer, and you are their descendants. That's it. That's what evolution is. It's not that basically one set of people says they are going to discuss. I think it's just that anything that wound up being slightly better than these pointing explanations might have won because there is evolutionary advantage. You see what I'm saying? I mean, if you're running away from the tiger and you are asking for people, I see it's like the house, running from the dragon, people asking why like this, and you are trying to do huge amount of miming, you die. The tiger would actually have to stop to mime, and then the tiger will eat you. So when you get eaten, you don't have kids. You can choose not to have kids, but certainly if you get eaten, you won't have kids. That's evolution. You see what I'm saying? So to some extent, there's an evolutionary advantage in communicating more symbolically, and language is symbolic. So whenever somebody says symbolic AI is no longer working, etc., I say, what the heck do you think is language? Symbolic doesn't necessarily mean logic. Logic is a formalized version of language. But language is very much symbolic. And language, and we are such linguistic animals. By the way, there's a lovely book called Language Instinct. Language Instinct, which basically by, I believe, what's his name? Does anybody know who talking about? This is Gary. This is, yeah, Gary Marcus is actually advisor. It turns out. Steve something, I don't remember the name in a minute. But Language Instinct is like a lovely book. Basically talks, it's somewhat speculative, but talks about all sorts of things that human evolution had, including the fact that humans are the only animals that are so damn vulnerable when they come out of the mother. Right? If you see in National Geographic shows, you see that like the calf falls from the cow and then gets up, starts walking. Humans take like months, years. And some humans don't leave the parents' house until 2025. You see what I'm saying? So it's like very hard stuff. And it was basically the beginning part of the reason is it turned out that having a bigger brain and the bigger brain with the language center was so important that essentially evolution didn't figure out. When we say evolution figure out, it's just that those people wound up doing better. So it turned out that with a smaller head, which is not fully developed, it's easier to come out and then still kind of continue growing. There is an extended infancy for humans. And it was so important because it had such high, and in fact, in a sense, evolutionarily, safety-wise, human babies are like the most vulnerable things in the known creation. No, I should say the word creation, sorry, but known evolution, right? And yet, basically, evolution wound up preferring that because there's huge advantages having that bigger brain. So that book actually talks a lot about that. But so, in a way, you can actually argue that language was invented, obviously, for communication. And some of the communication is basically involves giving expressions and taking advice. Okay? So it's just too painful to think in terms of pointing, especially when you have space-time video tubes that you need to point. And those days they didn't even have videos. Remember that, right? So point explanations are hard to comprehend. Pointing explanations are not just unwieldy in terms of communication because they're hard to comprehend in many cases. Now, this is what the kind of sequential decisions you need to provide, videos. Humans probably developed, I don't even know what this something is, developed symbolic vocabulary and exchanged symbolic explanations where possible, and come down to pointing explanations only when the vocabulary is inadequate. And then anytime we are finding that we are pointing excessively, we'll make a name for it. You see what I'm saying? So one of the weirdo things to me is that even something as simple as tacit knowledge tasks like basketball, right? Just basically it's a physical sport, right? But there are commentators who talk about what's going on. And in fact, I'm not a particularly good expert in even watching basketball. I mean, my son actually works there in one of the teams, but I mostly see the two numbers and see which number is bigger and say that he must be winning. So that's my understanding of basketball. But I understand that there's this concept called pick and roll. And it's actually a pretty complex concept. Multiple videos can correspond to pick and roll. There's actually a TED talk explaining this by the guy called Rajiv Maheshwaran, who essentially did the first basketball analytics startup. Basically basketball is one of the most instrumented games. because it's a small area and then tons of high quality cameras, etc. So these guys started labeling them and providing the data to people, etc. And so he actually wound up giving a data. But the point I'm bringing up there is we make up symbolic names to refer to non-symbolic concepts. That's basically what language already is. Language is a huge abstraction over space-time signal cues. And that's what you are using. Instead of making me give the video of my life and point to it, you just said, well, because, and then you gave these, linguistic explanations. Now, those linguistic explanations would be consistent with many, countably infinite number of videos that I could have taken of my life. They're all consistent with that. But there are also infinite number of other videos which are not consistent with this explanation. That's what abstraction is. You see what I'm saying? Language is an abstraction over sensory information. Yes?
So would playing a game of charades to explain that still be more in the symbolic side rather than the pointing, because it would also require...
So one of the very interesting things about charades is try to play charades with an Eskimo. Don't play charades with somebody who has the same common background as you. First of all, part of the charades basically is guessing the symbol name. Right? When you imagine an answer to the, I assume, I wasn't there, I'm old, but I'm not that old, but when language wasn't invented, when they were doing charades, the answer to the charades also is charade. You do like this, and somebody else says, that. Like instead of saying, oh, you mean Friends, the show, which is actually symbolic. You can't say that anymore. You have to write your own, this thing. So language, the charades is actually language game where you are assuming how much of non-symbolic movements can remind you of the symbolic concepts. Right? And it required that actually language was there to begin with, otherwise it would have done that. So then basically it works for the explicit knowledge tasks to have symbolic thing, but it can also work for non-explicit knowledge tasks. And one of the interesting things that we did before, and I'll do this and then we'll take a break and we'll come back to the other part. There was a paper that I'll send you, and then a bunch of other papers which are technical papers. This is a blue sky paper. And what we were arguing is, so there's this notion of neuro-symbolic AI. Bogus, because it's not well defined. It's not so first of all, the issue about neuro-symbolic AI can be, are we arguing that AI systems must reason in terms of symbols? Or are you arguing that AI systems should provide a symbolic interface? Those are very different things. I would argue that none of you are symbolic in your brain, because your brain is basically, it's not exactly transformers, I know that, but it is a lot more closer to some neurons and some activations, right, than it is to logical concepts, and basically, modus ponens being done, right? But because you guys don't have the neural link, which you should thank Elon that it's still not there, you had to invent a way of communicating. You provide to each other an external symbolic interface. There is a difference between internal symbolic reasoning and external symbolic interface. All you really need for this part of the whole thing, basically, for the AI systems to get along with humans, etc., is that they present an external symbolic interface. It doesn't really matter what they do, because we ourselves are not doing symbolic reasoning. We have no idea what we're doing.
What's the general premise of your symbolic AI then?
As again, many things don't have any premise. Again, my aim in life is to make everybody unhappy. So I mean, the neurosymbolic people basically think that I'm one of them, and I make fun of them. Basically, I actually have a slide showing this point that internal versus external neurosymbolic. And it's important to understand this because internal neurosymbolic people think that you start from pixels and generate your own abstractions inside without any connections to humans or anything, because abstractions can be generated. And those abstractions will correspond to some symbols later on, and then you are doing reasoning. So remember, abstraction is nothing but disjunction. In fact, that was a question almost in the thing that I removed it. But abstraction is nothing but disjunction, right? Disjunction doesn't have to have a name. Some disjunctions have names, and that basically becomes symbols. So if one of the interesting questions in the internal neurosymbolic thing, and I'll put that slide, and maybe I'll show it to you after the break, is when systems develop their own abstractions, there is no reason to believe that they will develop the same abstractions that you develop. Which is basically what what's his name was saying, what Wittgenstein was saying, that even if lion were to speak, you won't understand. They will develop some kind of symbolic concepts, but does not necessarily have to be the same as yours. It's not necessary that our particular symbolic representation is the right one, per se. It's just the one we share. And it seems to be dicey to depend on machines coming up automatically with the same abstractions that we computed. So here I'm basically kind of yelling at Jan, because Jan's hope is that the Japa-style world models basically want to learn things directly from pixels and generate internal abstractions. But eventually, if you want to align them to anything that you are doing, you talk a language. We are language animals. All our civilizational knowledge is in language. It's not that there are a large number of movies that we have recorded from whatever the biblical times that we keep watching. It was all language. And so not having that reduces, if you think LLMs are hard to align, you haven't seen nothing yet. If you have an alien thing basically generating its own abstractions to improve its performance, but it didn't co-evolve with you. So there's no reason for it to make sense to you. So alignment will be much harder. So external neurosymbolic, on the other hand, says, I don't care about what you do, as long as you present a symbolic persona outside, which, by the way, is what all you guys do. Right? Because you present a symbolic persona outside. You take language-based advice, and maybe sometimes multimodal, but language is very much part of it. And you provide language-based explanation, also sometimes multimodal. Without language, the language should be there. It's not just like, gestures. Right? And so the interesting question then is basically what we are arguing is that symbols as a lingua franca is important for machines to deal with humans. And that way you don't need to worry about cutting down their efficiency. If it's actually better for them to do reasoning in a very different representation, fine, that's okay. As long as we can have an interface through which we can discuss, basically provide explanations and provide advice and take explanations back in language. So the idea is this AI agent might very well be a deep reinforcement learning agent with pixel-based representation. In fact, there are papers we did where we talk about, I forget, basically the sort of the Atari game scenarios, where deep RL agents will look at the Atari game scenario in terms of pixels. The humans looking at it look at it in terms of objects. And so when you can, the thing about deep reinforcement learning is that actually these systems, even though they reason at pixel level, they're doing interesting behaviors. But the point is, it's all completely fine. You don't need language if you are on Mars. And if you are by yourself, you don't need language, because where you could communicate. There's another very interesting question as to whether language is needed for thought. That's a much more philosophical question. But really, there is no necessity for language because if there's nobody else, then you don't need to exchange anything. And certainly not with humans. If there's a huge number of robots, they can just have hive mind, and they don't need to talk. Right? It's the humans who I hope will never have a hive mind. And if neural link happens, then we'll have a hive mind and we'll be very sad. Please don't ask for it. Yes.
You said you don't need like language if you're the only one.
Mm-hmm.
But aren't there like a lot of abstractions that we're able to come up with because we like talk aloud in our mind, which is
Again, what I'm saying is, you have to ask the people before the language was invented. To some extent, now we basically, that's the interesting part. In fact, this paper ends with a paragraph saying that the thing that you put up as a persona for other people might eventually become you. And I'll give you like a bad example, but an example on the same. As you probably can't tell from my lovely accent, Midwestern accent, but I didn't speak English growing up. So I basically, until my 12th standard, I studied in Telugu, which is my language. And so I remember thinking in Telugu and converting everything. There was a quick translation going on. If you say hi, then I'll translate into Telugu and then figure out in Telugu what the response should be, and then say maybe it should be saying hi and hi back to you by the time you're done. This happened for me in IIT when I first went to IIT. And Americans won't understand it because they only know one language, unfortunately. They say there is what is the polyglots, and they are dual language people, and they are Americans. They just know one language. But if you have two languages, you will know this. The question of thought, and I actually remember for a while, first of all, introspection is a lousy form of understanding what we are doing, but I do remember that for a long time I should still think in Telugu. Now I don't seem to. So now I'm in the opposite problem. When I talk to my mother, I have to push myself to think and speak in Telugu. Otherwise I just very easily go into English. Bad English, none the same, but still English. Do you understand what I'm saying? So when you put up this external front, eventually you might become that. That's an interesting thing, but that's not a technical part that I want to, potentially push, but it is actually possible. It's indeed very much possible. So in fact, we had, I think, I don't know if I've mentioned this in this class or not, but we had like a brilliant teacher in IIT who used to teach us circuits. And that guy, obviously he's a comedian, but he would speak, obviously. The language of medium of instruction in IIT Madras was English. And so he would talk us in English, but then he could do very complex multiplications, divisions, etc., multi-digit, decimal division, etc., very fast. He was like fast in arithmetic, except only in Tamil. So he would be talking to us in English, and then he will write, some 45.798 times 70, 33.478, and then quickly go into a long rant in fast Tamil. That's a reasoning place, quote unquote. And then we write an answer. And the answer would be correct because we can press on the calculator and say that's correct. So even though he's thinking for most of the other things was quote unquote English, he still reverted to Tamil because that's where apparently his number sense is. All these points are making in terms of whether whether talking to yourself and the language in which you talk to yourself, how does it matter, is a very interesting philosophical issue. But all I'm saying is there's pixel space and there is linguistic space. I'm not saying that my AI agent speaks Russian and how the heck do I live with this? Because Russians have symbols too. Right? And that's where machine translation works. That's very easy. But the translation here is from sensory information to symbolic information. You see what I'm saying? So one of the things that we were arguing essentially is, irrespective of, even if it is actually doing reasoning with this, RL, deep RL sort of a thing, it essentially should be able to, when I ask it, why did you do this action here as against the other action? It should be able to generate an explanation that comes out through the symbolic interface. It should be in terms of the vocabulary that the human understands. Which means it needs to understand how to map the vocabulary items to its internal representation, which is basically what we do when we learn language. Okay? Yes?
So does this tie into, like, in your recorded lecture where you talked about DeepSeek, how they translated a lot of Chinese stuff to English stuff to get more explanation on that, how that diminished.
That is basically, they're both symbolic, but they were just assuming. In fact, that's connected to some extent. Hopefully I'll get to it. But this issue of whether LLM's reasoning traces have any meaning. That's the thing. I mean, so somehow, the point there is R0 was, R1 is no more giving faithful reasoning traces because it uses English words than R0 was. Both of them, essentially, I mean, that's my hypothesis. That's what I talked about in those lectures too, that, basically the traces essentially help the LLM. That's it. They don't necessarily have to help you. And that makes a big problem that we'll get to, which is just because you have shared a language doesn't necessarily mean that the reasoning traces suddenly tell you what the LLM is doing. You just call them reasoning traces, but you don't necessarily have to be called reasoning traces. Okay, so that becomes a big issue. That's what hopefully the second part is. But I want to just complete this and give you a break and we'll come back. So there is exponential generation here, and then so basically there is an ICLAIR 2022 paper where basically we show how this kind of a mapping can be learned, and then you can convert explanations from symbolic, from the internal representation of the AI system to vocabulary items that the human has. Okay, and similarly, and then basically there's a lot of technical details that I don't have time, but if you're interested, read that paper. And then similarly, you can, and there's all sorts of things you can do, but similarly you can do the accepting of the advice. That means the advice can be in language, but then ultimately you will only, so in some sense what was happening is the explanation was, for the internal explanation might be in the saliency region, in the Atari game, it somehow had to convert into some sort of an object or symbolic representation. And similarly, the advice might be high-level vocabulary. You need to convert it into things that make sense at the pixel level. Right? Okay. So there's a bunch of that stuff in the paper. And then similarly, so the advising part, there was a ULIPS 2021 Spotlight paper that talks about how symbolic advice can actually speed up the reference learning. Okay, again, I'm basically dropping paper names just to give you the bigger picture, because each of them I can spend time explaining. Anyway, so that's one of the papers. And that basically, that guy is Lin Guan, who wound up doing the options paper that you read, as well as the paper on learning models in LLMs. We were doing this stuff before we got sidetracked with LLM reasoning, at least my lab. Okay. So there's a whole bunch of other things. And then basically there's a blue sky paper we wrote. We're talking about if you take this into consideration that symbolic lingua franca has to be learned and used in talking to humans, then what are the challenges? Is you need to get the concept set, you need to ground the concept set, you need to expand your vocabulary. Sometimes there is no way you can convert, let's say, what is actually the saliency region into a vocabulary item that the human can understand. So you either have to take existing vocabulary that the human has to see if they will fit. And in the case of Move 37, you need to invent vocabulary. Remember what actually, ask yourself, what actually do people mean when they say, we can't understand Move 37? It's inexplicable. You know what I'm talking about, by the way. Move 37 is that AlphaGo Move 37. As I mentioned, DeepMind is now going to have its London headquarters named Platform 37 because they're next to King's Cross. King's Cross has Platform 9.5, which most of you guys know. And so now they have Platform 37, which is DeepMind's headquarters, because the Move 37 became that popular in the imagination that they could use that. But what actually do people mean by saying, I can't understand why 37 Move was made? What is there to understand? It won the game. According to fair and square rules, it won the game. There's nothing to understand. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's like saying, I can't understand how I got into this plane in DC and I'm here in Phoenix. I can't understand how this happened. So that's it. You don't understand, but the humanity understands. What we mean when we say we can understand is because there is no compact. And in fact, there is another explanation, which is, what do you mean you don't understand? Here is the entire search tree. And as you can see, it won fair and square. That's your explanation. That's true. In the case of AlphaGo is not an LLM. So it's doing clean search. So you can actually say this is the search tree. It's not like it tried to bamboozle Lee et al. To say, look, I won, and then hypnotized him. No such thing. It was fair and square. When you say you can understand Move 37, what you really mean is you don't have a linguistic explanation as to under what conditions can that move be repeated. That's what you don't have. This is what we mean by saying explanations. In general, saying, well, it works in this case, that's not enough. It leaves us kind of unhappy, unsatisfied. So what you actually have to do is basically expand the vocabulary that even the humans don't have, to invent words to actually say, under these conditions, where these particular the conditions will be denoted by these symbols, this move can be used. And remember, ultimately we do this all the time. I mean, half the time I don't understand that I'm thinking about even chess, forget about Go, because they're talking about castling. What the heck is castling? I don't know. But people who play chess know castling. They made up a move because for a while they were trying to explain and they said, make a name and then just say castling is this name. That was a development of vocabulary. And that's what you mean by saying, let's explain group move 37. And so in terms of vocabulary expansion, it can be from the human side, we can also do it from the machine side. It might say, okay, you don't understand, let's now create this concept with respect to which, we'll now assume this is part of a common vocabulary, and whenever this concept holds. And there it's the human who needs to learn the concepts grounding, not the machine. You see what I'm saying? So basically, in this whole thing, which went on for a bunch of time, basically we were arguing, this came between, in my group at least, it came between the MR, MRH kind of stuff and the LLMs, right? And where we were arguing this whole thing, essentially that AI systems should support symbolic interface for communication with humans, independent of whether their internal operations themselves are done in symbolic ways. It's not required that you must be doing reasoning in symbolic ways. It's only required that you explain it in symbolic ways. And you take advice in symbolic ways. And I would argue that that's what you guys are doing. Because you don't know how you're thinking. Right? So explanation and language are actually very important from that perspective. And then so we discussed the research challenges, of course, and this is the blue sky paper, symbols as a lingua franca, and that's how it brings up these issues. So this was done, and then LLMs came. And even as we were doing this, LLMs are slowly coming out, and now LLMs are there. A weird thing is, LLMs basically speak the same language, quote unquote. There is no such thing as, you don't need to ground things anymore. Because in all those things you are asking, you need to slowly learn to ground terms. And as if it's a retail, every system separately grounds things. But here, in the case of LLMs, you sort of grounded the entire human vocabulary at some level by showing the usage of that vocabulary in the web scale corpora. And it got some kind of a grounding. And it seems to be understanding what we are saying, sometimes. Sometimes we get to laugh at it, but sometimes it does. Right? So the question, of course, is why won't LLMs actually solve all these problems? And we are done, essentially. And so the issue basically that I'm trying to get after the break, I think, we'll take a 10-minute break and we'll come back, is I want to at least tell you something about the fact that while they offer solutions to many core challenges that I was talking to you about, basically, they can be like human proxies, they can be doing some sort of mental modeling tasks, they can also provide explanations. But if you look at it closely, there are all sorts of problems. In fact, it turns out they basically, if you have LLM as a human proxy and you, the AI agent, ask, is this going to be understandable to the human, it might actually give you an answer that sometimes is right, sometimes is wrong. And a classic example of that is that paper that I'll show you again, which basically shows that things like, the Sally Ann test, they'll answer correctly sometimes, but if you, perturb the question a little bit, humans will answer it correctly, machines will answer it wrong. So they're fallible, right? And then the other thing is, can they be sound? Well, they can be sound. One way of they can be sound is their reasoning trace is a sound logical reasoning, and so they just show you the reasoning trace, and that you should be able to explain. You should be able to make sense of why they came up with the answer. But unfortunately, as I was saying over the semester, reasoning traces have no actual reason, at least for academic. Okay, so you should at least consider that possibility. And then you can just say, forget about reasoning traces, we'll just ask them to explain. After they give an answer, you say, why do you think it is correct? So you give an explanation. Is that the reason it came up with the answer? No, not necessarily. So if I can, so basically this is where I get to this part that, that George Bernard Shaw basically said, America and England are two countries divided by the common language. We have the same language, but we can't necessarily depend on the same understanding, right? Because of the way of usage. And so, as I was saying, instead of Samba in Rio, I'll be giving a talk which corresponds to the rest of the class, which obviously, is only do like a review here. Think more about it over the weekend too. But basically, the humans and LLMs actually share this language, but that doesn't necessarily solve all the communication problems. In particular, I just made this before the class, and this is what I had in mind. I keep telling you about GDPR, right? So imagine, the guy goes to a system, AI system, and says, give me a loan. And the system says, no loan for you. And its saliency region, whatever thing basically corresponds to, well, deny the loan, the guy is too yellow. He's yellow, and we shouldn't give loans to yellow people, right? And but then basically that's not a good explanation. But anyway, that's the real reason, at least for the machine, for the point of why that explanation that thing happened. Okay, but then the yellow guy gets very angry, and because he has GDPR on his side, he asks, "Tell me why I got denied loan." That explanation question is sent to an LLM. Can happen, right? Imagine, I think I may have mentioned this in the class too, that there is a guy who's actually working on your car, right? When you give an auto repair thing, and then there's another smooth talking guy who I don't understand. They get paid more, but they don't actually do any car repair. But they are the ones who know how to talk to you well. And they'll give you, it is really important for you to spend these $1,600 like today. And if you get to talk to the guy inside who might give you a more nuanced thing, because if you don't pay $600, maybe in the next 5 or 10 years, the car might break down. And you might say, 5 or 10 years, I might not even be allowed, so I don't want to spend money. But the smooth talker will tell you, I can break down, and so you may have to spend $600. We have this already. So one guy is explaining, one guy is deciding. Right? That's exactly what happens if you have an LLM, basically answering questions, which is very much possible. So this is my nightmare, that, the systems might well make decisions using what are protected attributes, that basically unethical to use those kinds of attributes. And you can't catch them, because just like humans when they do, as I said, just like humans when they do decisions based on prejudices, they're smart enough to not say it loud. They will come up with some other reason. And LLMs, basically, again, they don't have any intentionality. According to my friend who was asking you, they're not trying to lie. They're not trying to lie at all. They know that when people ask for explanations about loan disapproval, which kind of explanations seem to be lied, because it's RLHF training. So it will give the kind of explanations you want to hear, by just definition. Now, this is the mind-blowing thing. It looked as if this was some kind of an AI system pre-LLM era, which at least knew what it was doing. It's just that the LLM wasn't talking to it. But now we are in a world where LLM does both. So we have a smooth talking car repair guy in the back who then comes out and smoothly tells you what you want to hear. And they are not connecting what they're doing in the back to what they're doing in the front. And this is a feature, not a bug, about LLMs. This is what they do. You understand what I'm saying? This is essentially what they do. And we are going to be dependent on them. So the funny part is basically this can happen even when if the approval system itself is the same LLM. The only way it won't happen is somehow there's a way of actually checking out from its reasoning traces whether it is doing reasoning or not. And as I said, that doesn't work. So let's take 10 minutes break and then I will go another 20 minutes after that. Just give me a second. Okay, let's get started so that hopefully we'll get done. So, as I said, this is one of the basic issues about, I don't know how to put this, but one, because LLMs are so memory based, and I brought this up multiple times during the class, they're like different from general reasoning based systems. They are actually useful, but they don't have some guarantees. Right, and so that sort of gets into these issues that, you know, the process that they use to come up with the solution guess might be different from the process they use to come up with the explanation guess. Both of them are dependent on the data. So they know what are the good kind of explanations, they know what are the good kind of the solutions. You see what I'm saying? And so this is, it's not that they're trying to lie, but that's basically what they're doing. So if you kind of give the explanation I want to hear, then you're not being truthful. Whether you liked it or not, you know, you could have done it deliberately, or you just said, yeah, normally when Rao asks, why are you looking at your laptop all the time during the class, is the kind of explanation he wants is basically I'm taking notes by looking at the laptop. And you know, that's it. That's the kind of explanation you fall for. So you will say whether or not you're doing this. You see what I'm saying? So, you know, whether you made that decision deliberately to lie, or whether that's the only thing. Oh, explanation means this, which is basically what LLMs do. It doesn't have to be intentional. You see what I'm saying? Anyway, so we were talking about this, right? So then a couple of things that I want to mention basically. Again, this part is also like quick higher level overview of like a bunch of, remember there's a whole bunch of things that I mentioned about the stuff that we did about going from pixel level to kind of generating combined vocabulary. And we are not the only ones, other people are doing this kind of a thing. And so the tricky issue is how many of those things actually have sort of been solved versus gaslighted away by LLMs. That's the question that we're trying to make sense of. So anyway, this is the thing that I was trying to refer to about neurosymbolic reasoning. I made this long back and tweeted it like a million years back, but I forgot to put this in the lecture. But yeah, this is basically the point, that there are like two very orthogonal motivations, as I mentioned. You know, one is internal symbolic reasoning, arguments that AI systems would need to employ internal symbolic reasoning for efficiency and scalability. Okay, the jury, unfortunately, is very much out on this, right? Because you could try it, you could say that symbolic reasoning is needed. It's hard not to make it sound like affirmative action for symbolic reasoning. Like we have done this stuff and we have all these techniques, please somebody use it. And so it's not a good argument in my view. Basically, there's little, and also other point is there's little reason to expect that internal symbolic abstractions that, I mean, even if you're using internal symbolic reasoning, we know that they're not going to use symbolic reasoning of the time old AI systems used to do, where you actually decided the symbolic vocabulary. Like PDR systems are symbolic reasoners. But what basically internal symbolic reasoning people say is even if you are starting from the pixel level or the sensory level and learn the abstractions and then do reasoning in terms of those abstractions, that would be symbolic at some level. But that basically, the problem is that there's little reason to expect that the symbols used as abstractions in internal reasonings will align well with those that humans use. Especially if you don't actually train it with language. And one of the weird things, I mean, since Jan won't listen to this lecture, I can say that I asked him, why are you so against using the language that is available? I'm completely fine with Java, which is nice, but why not also use the language data that we have available? So you could train the models. But he wasn't interested at that point. I mean, I don't know exactly what they're doing. But anyway, so on the other hand, symbolic communication interface is basically the external symbolic lingua franca.
So in your last point, are you basically arguing that why don't you co-train like the pixel level world model alongside like a symbolic world model and kind
No,
of
but basically you get the data of both levels. So basically there's actually work, and if you remind me, I'll send you a paper. There are lots of papers which basically show that so there's one of the things that's happening in the world models, I already mentioned this earlier, is many of these people are doing world model learning, others learning from pixel level information. But some people are trying to do, basically co-trained information, world model learning from pixel as well as language data at the same time. Okay, and there are reasons, and actually they say that they get better, more effective world models faster, and they're also like faster convergence. Which I can't be completely sure that their papers actually make sense, but it does make sense to me that such an idea would work like this. Because it is using the language information that, even when we are looking, as I said, even when we are looking at baseball or basketball, which are really, really beyond language, right? Or even eating, which is completely beyond language. We are such language animals that we write paragraphs about how something tastes. Give me a break. I mean, it's like, I want to talk about how the stringy pizza is like melting in the mouth. What the heck is all that stuff? Pizza is eating pizza. And in fact, this is one of my probably all-time favorite tweets where basically at some point in time, some people were saying that we trained LLMs on some physics, some this thing, and then it started answering physics questions, right? So it must have a model of the world, physics model of the world. And then I tweeted that I asked, whatever the model is, GPT-4, what pizza tastes like, and it basically said, describe pizza taste so well that I know that it has eaten pizza. And I think we should make sure that we don't starve GPT-4. We should feed it pizza because it really understands pizza eating. Right? It doesn't understand pizza eating. Right? It basically understands what people say about pizza eating. How many of you see Good Will Hunting? Okay, do you remember the beautiful dialogue where essentially Robin Williams is telling Matt Damon character that if I ask you about something, then you will talk about Shakespeare and Othello, and if I ask you something else, you will talk about this economics and what somebody else said about something else. But what do you think about it? If I ask you, what does it feel like to kiss somebody? You will tell me what somebody said, but have you had that experience? There's an interesting point to be made there. I mean, I understand Robin Williams is a great guy, but still not doing AI, but wherever he is. But the point basically is that language is a sort of a stand-in for certain things for which actually the extent is just symbolic, non-symbolic. Taste is a very non-symbolic thing. games are non-symbolic. But we are such language animals that we exchange everything in that. And I, as much as a big fan of language I am, I think it's overdone when people start writing these food critics, write 3-4 pages of how the pizza slice looks like. Give me the pizza slice. Forget about everything else. Right? And honestly, like, that's the thing. So, but, the point being, that's the thing that if you go train, then some of this leaching can happen with respect to, I understand nobody's training anything with taste. They're training with respect to, the textures of pizza images and the language about pizza, and then go training. And then it might say things, that kind of make more sense. So that's sort of what I was meaning. Anyway, so this is a symbolic lingua franca thing that I was referring to earlier. Okay. And then the couple of things that I want to mention is, so if you think in terms of LLMs versus classicalism, I just made up this slide. So in a weird way, I'm making my Sunday talk, like in front of you. So, because I made this slide when you went out. So one way of thinking about this classical AI systems, like think of planners. Right? That's the one we made explanations, and all the stuff about explanations and explainability was done with respect to PDL planners, quote unquote, their classical AI systems. Right? So the thing is that they can have soundness guarantees. We talk about soundness and completeness of an algorithm. We made a huge deal about the fact that strips cannot solve Sussman anomaly problem, or it can't solve register swapping problem. Because the expectation is that when you have an algorithm, you should have guarantees. Right? That went out the window with LLMs. They do a whole bunch of things, but no guarantees at all, like ever. Whatever people say, there are no guarantees for anything. They can't even necessarily guaranteed to say 2 + 2 = 4. If you prompt them just so, they might agree with you that some uncertain Sundays in the middle of winter, deep winter, it can be okay to say it's 4.7. I did try it, but you didn't get right, essentially. Because ultimately they've been trained to be, to some extent, extend the conversation. And again, you know all of this stuff, right? That if you allow LLMs to say, I don't know, whole bunch of hallucination will go away. But so will Sam Altman's business. Because for most answers, the right answer would be high confidence answers, I don't know, you should ask somebody else. And who's going to pay for the tokens? You are giving that. So you will make them say something, and whether or not they are sure. But whereas the entire classical systems won't say anything unless they're sure. It's not like the reason a strips plan might take too long when trying to solve a large problem is because it's not done with the search. You can't just whip it and say, give me some answer, give me some answer. I don't have the answer. I can't be sure what the correct answer is. LLMs can give you an answer. Whether or not it's correct, you have to deal with it. Right? Yes?
Can LLMs actually ever be made to say that they aren't sure, or is it really just like a design choice from people like all?
I mean, again, I said there's a big area in LLMs called uncertainty quantification. And it's a nice area, but it's basically in dark ages still. Because the best idea for uncertainty quantification LLM is to ask LLM, how sure are you? And then when somebody comes up with a Bayesian approximation to that, they check it against how sure are you at the baseline. And they're not much better. I'm not making this up. All I'm saying is that it's like easy to kind of take a dogmatic position that something won't happen. All I'm saying is I read the papers that are coming out. And this is where we are. Uncertainty quantification is a very good thing to work on. But nobody knows exactly how to do uncertainty quantification for LLMs necessarily. And the papers are reasonably laughable, honestly, if you understand. Again, if you don't understand, you'll be one of these influencers. MIT professors proved that LLMs can quantify their uncertainty. They never say ASU professors for some reason. But that's nonsense. None of them actually read the damn paper. They asked Claude to summarize it, at best. Okay? Anyway, so classical AI systems can have soundness guarantees. LLMs? No. If you don't have soundness guarantees, you can't even be sure that the notion of explicability, that means that is executable and closer to the other plan. If it's not even working, it's not sound, how do you say it's explicable? I mean, think about the following thing. Make LLMs do explicable plans. It will give you a plan. They're already, PDDL planners will give correct plans if they give plans at all. And making them explicable means give the correct plan that's closer to somebody else's expectation. LLMs were never giving you correct plans by definition. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but they don't give any guarantees. On top of it, if you say be closer to somebody else, yeah, sure, we'll do that, but that doesn't change the fact that both of them are like no guarantees. Right? And similarly, classical AI systems can provide verifiable traces of their reasoning. It's whether you like the trace of a PDDL planner or not. I mean, basically you might remember how to trace like a progression and regression plan, etc. Those traces will tell you whether it actually led to the correct plan or not. You can replay those traces. You can replay the A-star search traces. And LLMs can give some intermediate tokens, but they don't necessarily have any semantics. They don't necessarily have any semantics. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying they necessarily do. I'm not saying they necessarily don't have semantics. I'm saying they don't necessarily have semantics. That's enough. Because once in a while you can lie. Okay? Then I'm screwed. Right? Either you're truthful or you're not truthful. Once in a while you can lie. I don't know when the heck you're lying. I mean, you are lying by design or lying by accident, it's still lying. You're not giving me any guarantees. You understand what I'm saying? So, and we need to paste on the other hand, on the classical systems, we needed to paste on how to do shared vocabulary construction. And we needed to do how to do explanatory abilities, this whole thing about getting MRH closer to MR, etc. And trying to understand what humans MRH is, etc. LLMs will just guess it. Normal people like you seem to have this kind of MRH. And it's not even real that they do actually have to do the MRH, MR reconciliation. They can just give you an explanation. You can just ask for the end answer. Remember, you can ask LLMs for anything. You can ask for the plan. You can ask for the preconditions of the actions. You can ask for the domain model. You can ask for abstract strategy. You can ask for anything. They will never say no. You can ask them, are you correct? They will say something. Why do you think you are correct? They'll say something. Why do you think you are incorrect? They'll say something. And so the question, of course, basically is you need to paste on these things for the classical systems, but they come free with LLMs. But free, but without any guarantees. So human AI interaction, since basically that's kind of relevant to these lectures as well as my talk on Friday and Sunday, basically is what can you kind of depend on LLMs in terms of human AI interaction? Because on one hand, some things they are freely providing, on the other hand they don't. And for you guys, it's mostly repetition of what I've already said in the last few classes. You can, for example, this is the paper that, by the way, I didn't show the slides, but I mentioned last class. This is Siddhant Bhamri and Muniz Varma's paper in HRI 2024, which is basically kind of an extended version of this Tomo element sort of thing, where showing that on one hand, you could, so one issue, for example, in terms of if you believe that explainable behavior is all about having a mental model of the human. Right? And much of the work that we have done is we had to start with either knowing the MRH and then say we later on learn how to get the MRH. But the LLMs might very well have a reasonable MRH for normal, unwashed people. Because they've been trained with lots and lots of human data. Right? They're not starting from scratch the way like classical systems might be doing. And so one idea would be, why can't I have, basically this guy needed to have like a human in its mind, and human's model in its mind so that it will make sense to the human. Asking human is painful. You need to learn unobtrusively the human's model. But imagine instead of that bubble, maybe the next slide will show it. Now, that bubble, if I just put an LLM here, and the LLM basically stands for the human proxy. And you ask the LLM, I'm about to do this, do you think people will be surprised at this? Do you think people can understand what I'm doing? You can ask that. Imagine here, all I'm saying is this could actually be a classical AI system. If it's LLM, it doesn't even need to ask anybody. But if it's a classical AI system, it's about to generate a plan, it can ask its human proxy, the homunculus in its own head, about what humans like and does like, which is LLM. What do you think LLM, people like it? That sort of short circuits the whole issue of explicability in part, right? So the question, of course, is how good are LLMs in actually capturing mental models of the humans? And so that is basically where we did this work, and other people have done the work too, but essentially showing that in some cases they actually do just as well as normal humans. Because the robot itself doesn't know what other humans will, whether they like it or not. So instead of the reasonable way to evaluate this is, you can have some human subjects which basically look at this plan that it's about to generate and say, oh, do you think it will fly or not? Like you're asking your friends, do you think it will fly? Before I actually go out and do it in front of other humans. So you can do it with the humans or you do it with the LLMs. And the humans and LLMs more or less seem to agree in some obvious cases, right? And but the problem basically, but the problem basically is, so the alignment with the lay users is quite high in the beginning, but if you start making small changes to the questions that humans will know how to handle, LLMs will fall apart. That was the kind of thing I was saying, for example, that was the kind of thing I was saying about, let's say, in the Sally Ann case, right, the boxes are transparent. If the boxes are transparent, it changes the question very different, completely. And yet LLMs are more likely to give the answer to the original Sally Ann puzzle. Just like they're more likely to give the answer to the original missionaries and cannibals are the farmer and goat problem, even if they're stuck with like a vegetarian wolf or no wolf at all. That's the problem with memories, dependence, right? And so we show this. This was GPT-4 time. Again, things can change. Every one of these basically, as you do more training, things will change. But as I showed in the beginning of the class today, even today, there are LLMs ready to kind of put the plate first on the chair. There's a plate already on the chair, so first they sit on the chair and then remove the plate from underneath them and put it on the table to eat, which is kind of gross, but they seem to be very happy with that. Right? And this is after all sorts of great training we have done. So the point is that this jacket. So this is basically variations of this, that transparent box thing were tried in that paper, and then we can show that it's perturbation, with perturbations, LLMs are not as good as a human proxy. So it's like, sometimes they're okay, but sometimes they're not, no guarantees. And then, more stuff. And then the other thing, of course, is sound reasoning and explanation of sound reasoning. This, to some extent, I think that bigger lecture that you heard, at least somebody read the summaries of for the exam today, basically talks about these papers about intermediate tokens. You might think that intermediate tokens essentially tell you what LLMs are doing, but that's not necessary. And if they're not necessary, then where are you going to get the reasoning traces that will tell you whether the LLM is sound or not? You can ask LLM, are you sure? It seems like a dumb idea to ask me. Like we do this with humans though. And it's just as bad there too, honestly. But if I give you an answer and you say, are you sure, and why exactly are you wasting your time? I already gave you an answer. This is what I decided to articulate. So, but in LLMs, if you ask them, are you sure, they'll give you some answer. And that is supposed to kind of tell you about their uncertainty. By the way, one other is equally bad technique for uncertainty quantification for you is ask them like, 8 times, in a true-false question. Is it true or false? 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 Like 8 times or 9 times or something. And then count the number of times they say one answer. So relative frequencies, and assume that is somehow the answer. Seems like a really sad way to send rockets into space, right? Essentially, that we are used to having guarantees to some extent, and without guarantees and without the notion of soundness involved, you can't talk about explanations really. That's my point of that. Even though there is language which we have come with LLMs, and you don't need to do anything new to actually make them give explanations. They will give explanations, but that's just one more task. Yes.
Isn't the self-consistency, like iterative prompting, isn't that more like an approximate marginalization over the likelihood of reasoning basis?
But modulo the training data.
Yeah.
And we have no idea what the training data. It is some sort of a marginalization, but it's modulo the training data.
Yeah.
So the training data is good, and nobody talks about training data. Remember, I said one of the things that you should remember is open models are open only in terms of weights, not in terms of the data. There's only one model that is open and also gives out data, which is Olmo. They stop because you do know. Did I mention to you that the Allen organization basically said, "Screw it, we can't afford to, we can't compete with these guys." You see what I'm saying? So essentially, did I tell you this by the way? So the people who are developing these models were essentially Ali Farhadi and what's her name, Hannah Swishri, etc. And they all left and now joined Microsoft AI because they said that we don't have money to, but they have like $2 billion or $3 billion. That's like chump change. Right? That it's not what it is. I mean, and we basically, academia people have hundreds of dollars with which we are doing experiments. Like Vardhan sent me a message saying, I may be spending like $30. Is it okay? That's the level at which we are, essentially. And and Allen is closing down because they only have $2 billion. So in one way, actually, you can make the moat in terms of the cost is so high that most people can't try the other ideas. That's kind of unfortunate, but that's where we are right now. Anyway, so we did talk about the fact that basically uncertainty cannot be quantified, and and the thinking traces. I don't need to show you these because you just heard that in the explanation. But basically, you do know that the thinking traces look in language. They look in language, but they don't mean a thing. You can say gobbledygook in language. Stream of consciousness gobbledygook. I mean, a certain truth social account seems to be doing that. But it's language, but it may not make sense. Right? So that's the point about, this is the point about we are sharing the language, but can you make sense of this? Is one of the things I don't know if I showed it here, but I'll show it in the talk. But so for the 3-block stacking problem, this is the first page, second page, third page, fourth page, fifth page. Who checked this? See, it looks English, right? Looks good. That's nonsense. You see what I'm saying? You don't say, my extra search must be correct because it seems to say open list, closed list once in a while. That's not the way science works. You see what I'm saying? And yet we are ready to go with that. So certainly these don't actually have any connection to how the LLM is sort of reasoning from first principles to get to the answer. It's actually the best way, in case I didn't say it to you. Did I tell you the cooking analogy about spice rack and all that stuff? I don't know, I talked to so many people that, like yesterday I was giving a lecture, quote unquote, to these people from Singapore. They paid me good money. And you guys are just looking at me like this. But anyway, and basically I gave them 1 hour, 15-minute lecture, and some of them were taking notes, and I said, I don't even need your money. If you're taking notes, you'll get good grade. That's my way of looking at it. So they were actually taking notes. But anyway, so the point basically is that this sort of pseudo language, nobody actually can trace it, kind of simulate it to see if it led to the solution. what is it really, what is the way to make sense of these intermediate tokens? You should think of intermediate tokens as, it's the tokens that LLM says to itself to increase the conditional probability that the guess would be closer to the solution as verified by the verifier. That's it. That's what the 2 lectures that most of you probably need to watch was saying. You guys all wanted LLMs, but if I put it in lectures rather than here, you won't have to watch it now. But but the point is, these basically become large mumbling models to some extent. It's not LLMs, it's LMMs, and they're mumbling, and the mumbles help them. In the sense, they're increasing their accuracy, but they don't have to help you. And soundness and completeness are outside guarantees. And in some way, the analogy I was giving, I don't know if I may have given this, I thought, I was certainly giving it to these other guys, that the analogy is like, it's not the computational complexity of the problem, or solving the problem from scratch that these things are talking about. Even if sometimes say, let me now backtrack, aha, let me try it again, etc. Those words they say, it doesn't necessarily mean that they mean that. Do you understand what I'm saying? They can use those, and this is what I said, like taking gym lessons over phone. Okay, do crunches, 15 crunches. I've done 15 crunches. Did I do it? You can't tell. I did say the words that normally are produced, when you maybe crunch, especially when out of shape, right? And but that doesn't necessarily mean that is again. So the way to actually think about it, essentially, it's a good analogy to keep in mind for you guys. It's not a theoretical thing or anything, but if LLMs are a memory-based system, in some sense, they're trying to guess the answer for the new problem instance by looking at the answers for the problems that have been trained on, to some extent. If it's very much in the distribution, they need to kind of basically tend to say fewer intermediate tokens and give the answer. If it's not in the distribution, and I think, did I mention this thing about, maybe it's here, there's too many slides there. I actually don't have it here, but I should probably put that. If you have, if you train a model on like A-star mazes of 30 by 30 mazes, complex mazes of a certain distribution, and make it solve no maze. I must have mentioned this in the class at some point of time, which are like computationally trivially solvable, but LLMs die. They give a large number of intermediate tokens and then fail. Because they're not solving the problem from scratch. If you solve it from scratch, it's a trivial problem. They're solving it by using the memory. If the memory is too different from the instance you're looking at, you screw it up. You basically keep mumbling, and give the wrong answer. And the mumbles are actually great for Sam Altman, because the more you mumble, the more you pay them. The more LLM mumbles, then basically the more you pay, because each of the intermediate tokens produced is being charged at the output token value cost. But now that you kind of realize that, you know that you can't depend on the intermediate traces. There's a whole bunch of, there's actually an ACL paper, in addition to that A-star search maze paper, there's an ACL paper that's coming out. The A-star search, by the way, is in the TMLR, it's coming out, okay, they're supposed to submit it today, final version. And the other one, where basically more with the question answers, which basically is an ACL 2026. That has the same sort of issue that you train it with verifiable explanations versus train it with DeepSeek style tokens which make no sense. Humans make sense of verifiable explanations, but the accuracy is higher with the nonsensical mumblings, and which humans don't make sense of. So the point is, you can't depend on the intermediate tokens to give you some notion about how LLM is connected. Right? So then what else is left? So there's a whole bunch of that stuff I'm not going to go in, that's actually with that talk in the thing. That's again semantics, that's fine. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention before we go, you can see how many slides I'm skipping, basically is, and all this is complicated. The thing that I want to say is, why not just get the explanations directly? Ask the LLM for explanations. That's the last thing I want to say. Okay. So it gives you a solution. You ask, why is it correct? Why aren't you doing something else? You can ask all these questions. For each of them, I had to write an algorithm to actually do contrastive explanations, to actually do model reconciliation explanation. LLM gives you an answer. But is the answer going to be correct? It's going to make up an explanation. That was the point I was making, that essentially it doesn't know how it generated the solution, it doesn't know how it is explaining it. Right? And there may be correlations sometimes, but essentially these are like two very different things. And when it's explaining, it gives you the explanations that are more likely to be palatable, not how you solve it. Do you understand what I'm saying? Which basically means that explanations, that's my GDPR nightmare. That's what I showed you, that Homer asking for loan thing, right? So how do you ensure that the fluency of the LLM post-facto explanations doesn't engender undeserved or false trust? Part of the reason we ask for explanations is we are not too sure of the solution. We don't quite know why it is the right solution or the right decision to make. And so we are asking, maybe I didn't know something that you know, I'm asking you. And then with the explanation, I'm supposed to increase my trust in your decision. If I'm making the explanations willy-nilly, then the trust is gone. It's like you're just telling me what you want to hear, not exactly why it is correct. Right? So the question, of course, is you can generate and present explanations. My biggest worry is, to some extent, when LLMs give explanations, people will start thinking, oh, okay, that must be the reason it's right. They didn't understand the original solution. They also don't know that the explanation is actually truthful. And here it increases their trust. That's bad. Because you don't want to design AI systems that play off on our fallibility, cognitive flaws. You see what I'm saying? So what can you do? So one very small idea that we're actually playing with as we speak, in fact, Upasana and Vardhan are actually looking at this, and this is like, I'm going to end this here, but they are actually asking for LLM to provide both E plus and E minus. Why is the answer correct? Why is the answer wrong? And the good thing is, if you give an answer, you'll only, and if you actually correctly, if A star search gave a plan, let's say if a PTR planner gave a plan, and you ask it why is the plan incorrect, you'll say, what the heck is wrong with you? It's correct, I'm telling you it's correct. Why do you say, why is it incorrect? Do you understand what I'm saying? But for the LLM, you can ask, why is it incorrect? And he'll give you an explanation. It will be just as fluent as why is it correct. But the advantage is, at least you are making people to see both sides. An interesting example is if you actually submit papers to URIPS, LLMs are reading it. And previously it was non-stop LLMs, it's bad reviewers who are sort of LLM wannabes. Right? They don't quite understand why they gave the rating they gave. So rather than just ask them for a number, we say what are the positive things about the paper, what are the negative things about the paper. At least they have to do some work, and these days they just ask to write those. But in the old days they had to do something. So you can think of the positive things as the E plus as to why the paper should be accepted. And the negative things as the E minus as to why the paper should be rejected. And the area chair, who is probably the human in the loop, because the rest of them are LLMs, basically is going to look at E plus and E minus and decide what. So this is our small idea right now. But the bigger point is, on one hand, it looks like LLMs can explain things. That explainable AI actually more or less came to a grounding halt. Because, what do you mean explainable? It's in English, there's nothing to explain. And if you want, I will make an explanation up. But I won't tell you whether it's correct or wrong, because just anything I make, it's plausible. Like as I think in Seinfeld or something, he says, but it's not true. I said it could be. It could be a true explanation. So that's pretty much the way it's plausible. But that's not what you mean by explanations. So if you're giving plausible, then at least give plausible plus and plausible minus, so that maybe humans can decide, humans who don't actually know. If they know the answer as to why it is correct, remember the following thing. Nobody asks an LLM, if you ask them what is 4 plus 7, and it said 11, you shouldn't be asking it why is it 11. I hope you have better things to do in life than asking why is it 11. Because you know that answer is correct. I don't know why you asked it, but you know its answer is correct. If on the other hand you ask a question for which you truly don't know the answer, that's why you ask it. That's where explanations help. It's like the reason you ask your doctor, why do you think, doc, that I'm about to die in 15 days? Is because there is nothing, there is no obvious provable method in which on the forehead it shows, if you show a light, it's a 15 days for this guy. That they came up with some decision based on some internal tests, and some mumbo jumbo. And you can't make sense of it. You could be right, you could be wrong. So what do? You ask, what do you think is the explanation? And then you kind of see whether the explanation is making sense. Or you can ask self-consistency, ask 18 doctors. And before that, 15 days are over, so you're dead. But that's a different story. But 15 days, ask the doctors 15 different opinions and take the majority opinion and see what to do. And then hopefully United or Blue Cross would have already canceled your insurance after the second. But this is the world we live in to some extent, because we ask for explanations when we can't independently verify. If you can independently verify, then there is no need for explanation. Like you don't ask why is the plane going to fly, because it's been verified. People did math. People better than you have done the math and figured out under these conditions it's done. And once in a while it will fall down from the sky. And then there's a good reason that when that happens, Boeing stock will also fall down. But AI company stocks don't seem to fall down. LLMs make up stuff. We are currently in this wow, how creative it is. It seems to be still better than yesterday. I mean, this nonsense about this is the worst AI system you would ever see in your life. That's also true for planes, by the way. That's true for any technology. All of human civilization is going to go back forward. But you can still say this is so bad that you should be careful. Right? Anyway, so that's about explainability and how that connects to LLMs. And to some extent, there are things that it gives you answers just like anything else, but there's no guarantees. Okay?